When I first opened my eyes, the harsh, sterile light above me was blinding. I blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The unmistakable smell of antiseptic and the faint hum of machinery told me I was in a hospital. My head pounded, and a dull ache radiated through my body as I tried to sit up. "Hello?" My voice echoed weakly in the empty room. There was no response. I glanced around, the room eerily still. The white sheets on my bed were crisp and clean, and the medical equipment beside me hummed softly, but there were no doctors, no nurses, no other patients. A growing sense of unease gnawed at me as I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood, my legs trembling under my weight. I clutched the IV stand for support and took a tentative step forward. The room was painfully quiet, the only sound my labored breathing. I made my way to the door and pushed it open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The hallway stretched out before me, long and dimly lit, with flickering fluorescent lights casting ominous shadows on the walls. I called out again, my voice swallowed by the empty corridor. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Again, there was no response. I shuffled forward, my footsteps echoing loudly in the deserted hallway. Each door I passed was closed, and a sense of dread built with each step. Something was very wrong. Hospitals are never this empty, this silent. At the end of the hall, I saw a nurse's station. Hope flared briefly as I hurried toward it, but when I rounded the corner, I found it abandoned. The computer screens were dark, and papers were scattered haphazardly across the desk. It was as if everyone had left in a hurry. My heart pounded in my chest as I rifled through the papers, searching for any clue as to what had happened. Amidst the chaos, I found a patient chart with my name on it. My hands trembled as I read the details. Admitted 3 days ago, severe head trauma, condition stable. But there was no discharge date, no indication that I was supposed to be alone. A sudden, loud crash echoed down the hallway, making me jump. It sounded like it came from one of the rooms nearby. I hesitated, fear rooting me to the spot, but curiosity and the desperate need for answers pushed me forward. I followed the sound to a room halfway down the hall. The door was ajar, and as I approached, I could hear the faint sound of whispering. With a trembling hand, I pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the flickering hallway lights behind me. I squinted, trying to see into the shadows, when a figure suddenly darted out of the darkness and grabbed my arm. I screamed, stumbling back into the hallway. The figure stepped into the light, revealing a gaunt, disheveled man in a hospital gown. His eyes were wide with terror, and his grip on my arm was painfully tight. "You have to get out of here," he whispered urgently. "They're coming for us." Before I could respond, he let go and bolted down the hall, disappearing around a corner. My heart raced as I stood there, trying to make sense of his words. Who was coming? What was he talking about? Summoning my courage, I decided to follow him. Maybe he knew a way out. As I turned the corner, I saw a set of double doors marked "Exit" at the far end of the hallway. Relief washed over me as I hurried toward them, but my relief was short-lived. The doors were locked, a heavy chain and padlock securing them shut. Desperation clawed at me as I banged on the doors, hoping someone outside might hear me. But the silence that followed was deafening. I was trapped. I turned to retrace my steps, my mind racing with possibilities. There had to be another way out. But as I made my way back down the hallway, I noticed something strange. The doors to the rooms I had passed earlier were now open, and the whispering had returned, louder this time, echoing through the empty halls. Fear gripped me as I quickened my pace, the whispering growing louder with each step. It seemed to be coming from all around me, a chorus of voices speaking in hushed, frantic tones. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but their urgency was unmistakable. I rounded a corner and froze. The hallway ahead was filled with shadowy figures, their faces obscured by darkness. They stood silently, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Panic surged through me as I backed away, but the figures began to move, slowly advancing toward me. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears. The whispering grew louder, a cacophony of voices urging me to flee. I darted down another hallway, hoping to find an open door, a window, anything that could be an escape route. But every turn led me deeper into the labyrinthine hospital, the layout seeming to shift and change around me. Finally, I burst into a large, open room filled with rows of empty hospital beds. The whispering stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I collapsed onto one of the beds, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to make sense of what was happening. That's when I saw her, a young girl, no older than 10, standing at the far end of the room. She wore a simple white dress, and her eyes were wide with a mix of fear and sadness. She raised a trembling hand and pointed to something behind me. I turned slowly, my heart sinking as I saw what she was pointing at. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway, its form shifting and undulating like smoke. It moved toward me with a slow, deliberate grace, and as it drew closer, I could feel a cold, suffocating presence enveloping me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached out, its hand closing around my throat, and everything went black. When I awoke, I was back in my hospital bed, the sterile light flickering above me. The room was empty, and the air was still. My body ached, and my throat was sore, as if I had been screaming. I glanced around, my heart pounding as I tried to make sense of what had happened. Was it all a dream, a hallucination brought on by my injuries? But as I lay there, trying to calm my racing heart, I heard it again, the soft, insistent whispering echoing through the empty halls. I knew then that I was not alone, and that whatever haunted this hospital was far from done with me. The light flickered once more and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The whispering grew louder, surrounding me, suffocating me. I closed my eyes, knowing that there would be no escape, no waking from this nightmare. And then I felt it, a cold, clammy hand closing around my wrist, pulling me deeper into the darkness. The last thing I heard was the whispering, a chorus of voices welcoming me to the void where the light could never reach. I had always prided myself on my family's lake house. It was an old, charming cabin nestled in the heart of a thick forest, right by the edge of a crystal-clear lake. My friends had heard me talk about it so often, and finally, I decided to invite them up for a weekend getaway. I couldn't wait to share the tranquility and beauty of the place with them. We set off on a Friday afternoon. My friends Jenna, Mark, and Alex packed into my car with laughter and excitement. The drive was scenic, and we arrived just as the sun began to set, casting a warm orange glow over the lake and the surrounding trees. It was everything I had described to them and more. The air was crisp, and the sound of the water lapping gently against the shore was soothing. The first evening was perfect. We unpacked, settled in, and gathered around a campfire by the lake, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The stars above were brilliant, and the moon cast a silvery light over the water. It was idyllic. As the night deepened, a strange feeling settled over me. It was as if the forest was watching us, the trees whispering secrets in the wind. I brushed it off as a trick of my imagination, fueled by the eerie atmosphere of the night. We decided to call it a night and headed inside. The next morning, we spent the day hiking and swimming. The lake was cool and refreshing, and the forest trails were beautiful, filled with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every so often, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. That night, as we sat around the fire again, Jenna suddenly went quiet, her eyes fixed on something across the lake. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. We all turned to look, but saw nothing unusual. "See what?" Mark asked, trying to keep his tone light. "A woman," Jenna said, her voice barely audible. She was standing on the other side of the lake, wearing a long white dress. We laughed it off, attributing it to shadows and Jenna's overactive imagination, but the mood had shifted. The laughter and stories of the previous night were replaced with unease and quiet conversations. Later, as we headed to bed, I couldn't help but glance out the window towards the lake. The moon was full, casting an ethereal light over the water, but there was no sign of the woman Jenna had seen. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a soft, persistent tapping. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the direction of the lake. I crept to the window and peered out, my breath fogging the glass. There, standing at the water's edge, was the woman. Her long white dress billowed in the wind, and her long black hair obscured her face. She was perfectly still, except for one arm which was slowly tapping against the trunk of a tree. I stumbled back from the window, my mind racing. I had to be dreaming. I forced myself to look again, but she was gone. The tapping had stopped. I tried to shake it off, but sleep eluded me for the rest of the night. The following day, the atmosphere was tense. Jenna looked pale and distracted, and even Mark and Alex seemed on edge. We decided to stick together and spent the day in and around the cabin. As night fell, the sense of dread grew stronger. We sat in the living room, trying to ignore the growing unease. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. Jenna screamed and I fumbled for a flashlight, my hands shaking. When I finally managed to turn it on, the beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the fear on my friends' faces. We heard it then, the soft tapping coming from the front door. The beam of my flashlight trembled as I slowly approached the door, my friends huddled behind me. The tapping continued, relentless and chilling. I took a deep breath and flung the door open, the flashlight revealing nothing but the empty porch and the dark forest beyond. The tapping had stopped, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. We decided to leave the next morning, unable to take another night of terror. As we packed up in the dim light of dawn, I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, and there she was, standing at the edge of the clearing, her white dress stark against the dark trees. Her hair still obscured her face, but I could feel her eyes on me, cold and unyielding. I blinked, and she was gone. The drive back to the city was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The weekend that was supposed to be a fun getaway had turned into a nightmare. Weeks passed and life returned to normal, but the memories of that weekend haunted me. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. At night, I would wake up to the sound of tapping, only to find nothing there. One night, as I lay in bed, the tapping started again, louder and more insistent. I tried to ignore it, but it grew louder, filling the room. I got up and looked out the window, expecting to see nothing. But there she was, standing in the street below, her dress glowing in the moonlight, her hair flowing in the wind. She raised her arm and began to tap on the tree in front of my apartment, the sound echoing through the night. I closed the curtains and backed away, my heart pounding. The tapping continued, relentless and inescapable. I knew then that I could never escape her. She had followed me from the lake, and she would haunt me forever. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, the woman in the white dress would always find me, and the tapping would never stop. I've lived in my apartment for 3 years now, and until recently, it was my sanctuary. Nestled in a quiet neighborhood, it was a place where I could unwind after long days at work and find some solace in the bustling city. However, everything changed when a new neighbor moved into the building across from mine. It started innocuously enough. One evening, as I was making dinner, I glanced out the window and saw a figure standing in the window directly across from mine. He was a tall, thin man, silhouetted by the dim light of his apartment. At first, I thought nothing of it, assuming he was simply looking out at the view. But as the days passed, I noticed he was always there, standing in the same spot, staring directly into my apartment. He never moved, never shifted his gaze. It was unnerving, but I tried to brush it off. After all, it was probably just a coincidence. Maybe he was deep in thought, or just liked standing by the window. Weeks went by and the figure became a constant presence. Every time I glanced out my window, he was there. His eyes, though I couldn't see them clearly, seemed to bore into mine. The feeling of being watched was inescapable, and it started to gnaw at my sanity. I began to close my curtains more often, but the feeling of his gaze still lingered. It was as if I could feel him watching me through the walls, his eyes following my every move. I became paranoid, checking my window obsessively, always finding him there, standing silently. One night, I decided to confront him. Fueled by a mix of fear and anger, I opened my window and shouted across the narrow gap between our buildings. "Hey, what are you doing? Stop staring at me!" He didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there, his expression hidden in the shadows. I slammed my window shut, my heart pounding, but the confrontation did nothing to ease my anxiety. If anything, it made it worse. My sleep became restless, plagued by nightmares of his face, pale and emotionless, looming over me. The feeling of being watched seeped into every aspect of my life. I couldn't focus at work, and my friends noticed my growing paranoia. I tried to explain it to them, but they just laughed it off, telling me I was overreacting. One evening, I returned home to find a note slipped under my door. It was a simple piece of paper with a single sentence scrawled in neat handwriting, "I see you." My blood ran cold. How did he know where I lived? How did he get into my building? Panic set in as I double-checked all the locks and closed the curtains tightly. But the note had shattered any illusion of safety I had left. That night, the nightmares were worse than ever. I dreamt of him standing in my apartment, his eyes fixed on me as I slept, his breath hot on my face. I woke up in a cold sweat, the feeling of his presence suffocating. Days turned into weeks, and my mental state deteriorated further. I started hearing whispers, faint and indistinct, as if he was speaking to me through the walls. I couldn't escape him. Every time I opened my curtains, he was there. Every time I closed them, I felt his gaze even more intensely. I contacted the building manager, but they dismissed my concerns, claiming they couldn't do anything about someone standing in their own apartment. The police were equally unhelpful, suggesting it was a neighborly dispute and advising me to ignore it. But how could I ignore it? The man in the window had become an omnipresent force in my life, a dark shadow that followed me everywhere. My apartment, once a refuge, had become a prison. I barely left it anymore, too afraid of what I might find when I returned. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a noise from my living room. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on glass. My heart raced as I crept out of bed and made my way to the living room, the tapping growing louder with each step. I reached the window and slowly pulled back the curtain. There he was, standing outside on the fire escape, his face inches from the glass. His eyes, hollow and dark, stared into mine with a terrifying intensity. He raised a hand and tapped on the window, the sound echoing through the silent room. I stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table and falling to the floor. I scrambled to my feet and ran to the door, fumbling with the lock in my panic. I burst out into the hallway, gasping for breath, and pounded on my neighbor's door. They opened it, looking confused and concerned as I babbled incoherently about the man on the fire escape. They called the police, who arrived quickly and searched my apartment. But when they looked out the window, the fire escape was empty. There was no sign of the man, no evidence that he had ever been there. The police left, assuring me it was probably just a prank, but I knew better. He was still out there, watching, waiting. I couldn't stay in my apartment any longer. I packed a bag and left, not caring where I went as long as it was far away from him. I found a cheap motel on the outskirts of town and checked in, hoping the distance would give me some peace. But that night, as I lay in the unfamiliar bed, I heard the tapping again. My blood ran cold as I realized I could never escape him. I pulled back the curtain, and there he was, standing in the parking lot, his eyes locked onto mine. The motel room felt smaller, the walls closing in as his presence suffocated me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, and then the door creaked open. He stepped inside, his eyes never leaving mine. The last thing I saw was his face, pale and expressionless, as he reached out for me. Now I am a prisoner in my own mind, trapped in an endless nightmare. His eyes haunt me, his presence suffocates me. I see him everywhere, feel his gaze on me always. There is no escape, no respite. He is with me, always, forever, and I know now that he always will be. My new apartment was everything I had hoped for, spacious, affordable, and nestled in a quiet neighborhood. There was only one downside, the basement. It was a vast, labyrinthine space, and something about it made my skin crawl. I avoided it as much as possible, but my laundry was down there, and eventually I had to confront my unease. One chilly autumn evening, I gathered my courage and descended the creaky wooden steps into the basement, basket of clothes in hand. The air grew colder and damper with each step, and the faint smell of mildew tingled in my nose. The single light bulb hanging from the ceiling cast long, eerie shadows that danced across the walls as it flickered sporadically. I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling and focused on the task at hand. The washing machines were tucked away in the far corner, almost hidden by a maze of old furniture and forgotten boxes. I quickly loaded my clothes, eager to finish and get back upstairs. As I poured detergent into the machine, I heard a noise, a soft, almost imperceptible scraping sound. I paused, listening intently. The light flickered again, casting the basement into brief moments of darkness. I told myself it was just the old building settling, but my heart rate quickened nonetheless. With the washing machine finally humming, I turned to leave. But as I reached the stairs, the basement door slammed shut with a force that sent a shiver down my spine. I rushed up the steps and tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to set in as I pounded on the door, shouting for help. The only response was the echo of my own voice. The light flickered more violently now, casting the basement into a strobe-like effect. In the disjointed flashes, I thought I saw movement, a shadow darting between the old furniture. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. Desperate to find another way out, I navigated the maze of boxes and broken furniture, my heart pounding louder than the washing machine. As I rounded a corner, I saw something that stopped me cold. A door I had never noticed before, partially hidden behind an old, dusty wardrobe. It was slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it inviting and terrifying all at once. Driven by a mix of fear and hope, I approached the door and pushed it open. The hinges groaned in protest, revealing a narrow, dimly lit corridor. The air was even colder here, and the smell of damp earth was overpowering. I hesitated, but the thought of staying in the basement was even more frightening. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, the flickering light bulbs overhead barely illuminating the path. As I walked, the walls grew closer, the ceiling lower, until I had to crouch to continue. The scraping noise returned, louder now, echoing through the confined space. I pressed on, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The corridor finally opened up into a small, circular room. In the center was a single, ancient-looking chair, and on it sat a doll. Its porcelain face was cracked, one eye missing, and its dress was tattered and stained. The light above the chair flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, using its weak flashlight to pierce the blackness. As I shone the light on the doll, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The doll's head had turned to face me. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly backed away, my phone shaking in my trembling hand. The scraping noise grew louder, coming from all around me. I turned and ran back down the corridor, the walls seeming to close in on me, the darkness nipping at my heels. When I reached the basement, the light bulb above the washing machines was still flickering, casting ghostly shadows. The basement door was now wide open, but my relief was short-lived. Standing in the doorway was a figure, tall and gaunt, its face obscured by shadow. The figure moved toward me with an unnatural grace, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. I backed away, stumbling over the old furniture, my heart pounding in my ears. The figure reached out, and I felt a cold, clammy hand on my shoulder. I screamed and bolted for the stairs, my mind a whirl of terror and confusion. I burst through the door and into the safety of my apartment, slamming the door behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I leaned against the door, trying to convince myself it was all just a nightmare. But when I looked down, I saw a small porcelain hand, cracked and dirty, lying on the floor at my feet. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs, slow and deliberate. I realized with a sinking dread that I hadn't escaped the basement at all. The horror had followed me, and there was no way out.